Welcome back to Anonymous Projects. Today we are back on this 1973 Dodge Dart that we've been doing a basically complete drivetrain swap on. Last time we got the Ford 8.8 shortened and ready to swap in. I got that bolted in off camera, I'll show you in just a second. But today we're going to be working on the front suspension. So this is super worn out, and I figured since we got the rear suspension all squared away, might as well get this good to go before we get ready to fire up, basically, because that's where we're at. So let's start working through it. So here's a quick look at the rear end set in the car. I put the brakes on and set it in off camera just because kind of boring. You basically just set it on there and tighten U-bolts. I also went ahead and got our shocks on, so we're basically all good to go. One thing I also did is I shortened the spring shackle to the stock length because the one that was on there was 2 inches longer than stock, which is not how you're supposed to lift the rear end of a car. That's what they were trying to do, but it ends up just settling back to normal. So hopefully our spring's good. So yeah, we should be all squared away in the rear. The only thing we got to do is get a drive shaft made to adapt the 8.8 to the 727. So this was a factory slant 6 car, but it is a disc car. We're just going to be retaining the factory disc setup. I did get new rotors. Obviously these ones are super groovy. You could maybe turn them, but there's no sense in not replacing them when they're cheap enough. And then I also got new calipers, so we don't have to go through and rebuild these. Again, cheap enough. Obviously new ball joints, bushings, bearings, so we're going to be doing the works on this. So we'll start off by popping our caliper off. So the caliper here's retained by kind of an interesting setup. We got these clips on the face of the rotor, of the caliper rather. We got a shim, and then the retaining clip. There we go. See, our brake line has seen better days, so we'll just be snipping that. Alright, now we can pop our rotor off. Brake pads had plenty of meat. Rotors were just trashed. See how loose our ball joint is? I can just move the whole spindle around, no problem. There we go. That grease has been in there just a little while. This grease actually isn't terrible. It's still semi-grease-like. Let's see how the bearing looks. Not terrible. No sense in reusing this kind of stuff though. New bearings like $3 or something. Ooh, that is a heavy rotor. Alrighty, there we go. There's our spindle, which we will be reusing. We do want to check it for any weird scoring or anything like that, but so far it's looking good. I think we'll probably hit everything with wire brush and, you know, give it the rebuild in a can. Alright, so now we can separate our ball joints. We'll probably start the upper one. A little bit of a grease ball here, but that's better than not. I mean, somebody's been greasing it at least. Not that it matters because we're replacing it, but... Someone mangled that. Ooh, that castle nut is loose. This thing must have had a mean loose suspension. Look, you can already see it separating. That's crazy. And that is why we have castle nuts with a cotter pin. One thing that is kind of nice and simplifies these Mopar front suspensions is that it's a torsion bar system, so we don't have to deal with the coil spring while we're trying to do this, which can be kind of a pain. Like on GMs, yeah, that ball joint is toast. You can see how loose it is. Boot is torn. I'll pop the lower, which is also totally beat. Another thing that's kind of neat with these is that the lower ball joint, it's not pressed into the spindle. It's actually a removable section, like we'll see here in a second. So that makes servicing really easy. There we go. Painful. Let's see if this one's loose too. Nope, so that's good. Just clean up the grease around it. Alright, hammer time. Wow, this one's actually on there. There it goes. Alrighty. Let's go ahead and get the upper A-arm off. Alright, looks like we got a nut and a lock nut. Okay, so there's one. Let's pop our shock off. Alright, now I'm going to undo the top nut for the shock and then it should fall right out. That shock's pretty worn out. It doesn't spring back, which still works a little bit, but definitely going to be a big improvement with a new one. So you can see we're actually moving the adjuster, but spinning it hopefully got a little loose. Wow, okay. I think it moved a little bit. There it goes. There we go. So we got adjuster washer on that side with the slot. Come on. And then there's the adjuster that attaches to the head of the bolt. So you see we got a flat on that. And when this turns, it kicks the A-arm forward or backward, which changes the camber. Now the arms should come out. Okay, yeah, wow. Wow. Those are some of the worst bushings I've ever seen. That's pretty impressive. Alright, well, good thing we're doing this. Got some crud in there we're going to want to vacuum out. Last thing we got to remove to be completely disassembled is just our strut rod. This particular dart doesn't have a sway bar, which is a nice to have, but it doesn't have it, so we don't have to deal with it. It may be a good add, but for now we're just rebuilding the stock. So we just got to yank the nut off here and then we'll get the front nut off in the engine bay. Alright, and there is the other side of our strut rod, so we'll yank that off. Alright, nut is off. Now we can yank it out the other side. Alright, so I think I actually went a little out of order here. To get the strut rod out, we're going to need to actually remove the lower control arm first. And to do that, we got to shift the torsion bar back. So what I'll do is I'm going to take all the tension off the adjuster here for the torsion bar, and then take the clip out on the rear of the torsion bar, which keeps it from sliding back. And then once all the pressure's off the torsion bar, we can knock the A-arm and the torsion bar back, and then hopefully they'll pop apart and this will come out. So that's the theory, at least. Let's see how it goes. So there's no tension on there. I'm going to crawl over back there and see if there's a clip to take off. Well, not see if there is, but take it off. So here's the clip I'm talking about. We got these two prongs, kind of like a snap ring. Once that's out, the torsion bar can come back. So we just gotta grip it. Out she comes. Got a bunch of grease buildup in there. So I'm gonna take the nut out that holds this pin for the control arm, and then we should be able to knock the control arm back. Okay, there we go. Now we get a little medieval. Ordinarily, if you're just removing the torsion bar, there's a special tool that clamps around the torsion bar that you can beat against to get it to move back. Since we're going to be removing the control arm, we can just knock it back and it should hopefully move. See, it is moving back, so that's good. There is the strut arm, and we might as well remove our control arm so that we can inspect the bearing. We just don't want to nick the torsion bar or anything like that. Now it's starting to go. Alright, that wasn't too bad. The bushing doesn't look terrible. So this bushing is kind of notorious. It's a bit of a pain in the butt to move, or to remove and replace. It doesn't actually look terrible, but we're here, so we may as well replace it. So real quick, let's disassemble everything to the farthest point that it needs to be. So go ahead and take out our old ball joint, bearings, stuff like that. And then I'm going to clean it up and get it painted. So let's pop all this stuff out. Alright, so first thing we'll do is pull our upper ball joint out. Chrysler had kind of a cool design in my opinion, which is pretty serviceable. The ball joint actually screws in, which definitely beats press in my opinion. So you do need a special socket. And I think there's two different sizes for early A bodies and B bodies and later A bodies, which this is. So we'll need to use that, but we gotta clean up all this grease here. Definitely wish cars these days were made to be serviceable like this. I mean, obviously there's stupid stuff in this car, like the lower ball joint. Or sorry, the lower control arm bushing is kind of a dumb design on this, but we'll get to that later. This kind of stuff's cool. Now everything is just like replace. Like half the time instead of replacing ball joints in new cars, you just get a new control arm. They do seem to last longer, so there's that. Yeah, stuff these days isn't even greasable usually. I guess it's kind of a trade-off between long service life versus having to actually service. If that makes any sense, or it doesn't. Okay. Good enough. Here's the sockets we need. Need the smaller one of these, I believe. Nope. Wait, yes. Just had it out. You can see how it's kind of a weird, like a square with rounded edges. Make sure it's on there good. Hopefully the impact will do it. It's a 3/4 inch socket, so I have to adapt. Yeah, there we go. Split off. It's coming. Let me cut off the boot, or maybe I can pry it off. There we go. Now we'll go the rest of the way. Go. Kind of worried. The threads look like they got damaged on the way out, but looking at the new one, it's the same kind of weird, really shallow threads. Interesting. Okay, well, now we can move on to pushing these out. You see just how bad these bushings were. The sleeves actually are all malformed from the inner sleeve hitting the outer. Luckily, the new set comes with new sleeves. A lot of times the polyurethane bushing sets reuse the sleeves and the control arms. Luckily this one doesn't, which means we do need to use the press, which is fine, so let's take it over there and press these sleeves out. Alright, so here's kind of the janky setup I've devised. The outer sleeves are pushed in from the outside of the A-arm, so we need to push them from the inside. Obviously then we have to go through the opposite bushing, so I didn't have a bolt that was long enough and strong enough, so I have 2 old head bolts with a wrist pin between them to keep the bolts from walking back and forth, and we're going to see if this works. I think it should. Yeah, it's going. Okay, we're getting hung up because I think that washer needs to come out, so let's flip her around. Alright, I think I'm just going to try knocking this out the rest of the way with an air hammer. Probably the easiest. There she goes. Alright. Now one more time. Means for this side. Alright, so here's the other bushing. You can see it actually wore so bad that it wore through the outer sleeve, which then wore into the arm and actually cracked it. So these aren't super readily available. I think we may try doing a repair on this. You can see the sleeve is still tight. It's just right there where the bushing failed that the inner pin actually wore through. So we may try bending this back. We'll clean this up really well. We'll drill a stop on the crack and maybe try hitting it with the welder and see how it does. The biggest thing is going to be checking that these holes, the upper and the lower, are concentric to each other. If they line up, we should be okay. But this is kind of a pain. You can see also it wore through the top of the ear. So yeah, these bushings are well past their usable life, obviously. So I'm going to go clean this up really good so we can see what we're working with and maybe bend it back a little bit, and then I'll bring you guys back. Alright, I got our stop holes, plural, drilled because it ended up cracking all the way along the collar. It's cleaned up. I'm gonna go ahead and just lay a bead where the bend begins and up the cracked part. Taking my time with tacks, I'm not gonna just lay a whole bead at a time. I don't want to warp the arm. So hopefully after that, we'll be able to press our new sleeves in. So I'm gonna go do that and bring you back. Alrighty, it's ugly, but got decent penetration, so we're gonna see how that does. If everything lines up square with the other bushing, then I think we'll call it okay. If not, then the arm's gonna need replaced. So, okay, so now let's turn our attention to the lower control arm and press out the old bushing there. Alright, so this bushing is kind of notorious in these Mopars. It's just under a lot of load and it wears prematurely, and it's kind of a pain in the butt to press out and in. So what we need to do is we need to press this pin out, which is easy. You just go in through the backside, and then we're going to cut out the rubber. And the problem is the bearing shell, there's actually nothing to press against. So what we're going to need to do is actually weld the washer in there, and then we'll use a bolt with a nut down against the washer, and hopefully that'll press the bearing shell out. So let's go take it over the press and do that. Alright, so to push the pin out, I'm going to use a wrist pin again. Should hopefully not put up too big of a fight. See, it's grabbing onto the rubber, that's why it's springing back so much. You know what, it looks like it's actually pressing. Oh no, it's doing it. Slowly but surely. There we go. So there's that pin that gets pressed in. Then here's the bushing, so we're gonna pull the rubber out. And then this shell, we're gonna have to weld the washer in. So let me go cut the rubber out. Let me move on. Maybe able to actually just kind of push it out from the back. Or maybe not. Alright, so there we go. I just needed to get a long screwdriver between and I pried her up. It's not bonded to the shell like a lot of bushings, so that makes it easy on us. So now I'm going to find a washer that fits close to snug in here, and then we'll tack her in and get to pressing. This bushing actually wasn't terrible as far as these go from what I've heard. It's worn, you can see it's egged out, but a lot of these, I mean, they get to the point where it's metal on metal like what we had on the upper A-arm. So, alright, so there we go. I couldn't find one that fit inside, so we're going to try welding along the edge. See how that works. Safe to say that did not work. So, you take two here. Okay, hopefully that will do it. Put some good beads in there. Yep, there it goes. Gotta readjust the bottom plate though. There we are. The heat seems to have helped loosen it up. Alrighty, that I believe is everything out of all the suspension components. So now I'm going to go through, wire brush everything really good, paint it, and then we're good to go ahead and reassemble. Right, so here's our freshly painted A-arm. Just did a quick paint job. Didn't go too crazy, but now we're ready to press the new bearing shells in. Bushing shell. So I'm just going to use a big socket. So put the shell there, and then the socket will be on the other side. That way we can press against it and it'll be able to pass through the socket hole. Alright, there's one. We're fully seated, so good there. Looks like our shell actually did get a little deformed from the deformity in the shoulder, so we'll see if that affects us or not. Not ideal. Alrighty, there we go. Alright, so I'm going to push in the actual bushing part. This is pushing by hand. We're going to need to take them back out to grease, but I'm just checking for concentric holes.
which obviously it's hard to tell on camera, but it looks pretty good to me, so let's put the inner sleeves in and see if that's still true. The pulley bushings usually get kind of tough to push out once you put the inner sleeve in, so I'm going to lube them up. They come with a special Teflon kind of grease, and pulley bushings will squeak if you just install them by themselves. So you got to grease them with a special Teflon grease that they provide. It is the worst. It sticks to everything, and it doesn't wash off pretty much with any solvent. So wear gloves if you're doing pulley bushings ever. Alright, so our bushings still look concentric after putting the pins and hardware on, so now we're ready to put our ball joint in. So we'll just thread it in. We're going to torque it in the car because it's got a spec of 125 foot-pounds. That's going to be a lot easier with the control arm braced against the body. So we'll just screw it in for now. In fact, we could even just leave it out until we get it in the car to keep stuff from getting in the grease. So let's go ahead and get the new lower control arm bushing pushed in. So luckily for us, reinstallation of the bushing is way easier than taking it out. So we're going to set the control arm on the plate, set our bushing on. We're going to need a plate to push against. There we go, bushing in. Now for our pin, we'll push it in the other way actually. Forgot to take off the old sleeve. It's actually still stuck on this, so I'm gonna have to cut that off probably. So there's the inner sleeve from the old bushing. So I just hit it with a Dremel on both sides until it cracked through, and then it slid right off. So now we can press this on. Okay, the press is trying to push the whole bushing through when I was pressing on the inner sleeve because the inner sleeve's not really supported on the back side. So I'm going to throw a socket back there and see if that will keep it secure. Trying to shift over on me. Alright, so there we go. That should do it all the way up against the shoulder. That's it for the lower control arm. Alright, before we get anything back in here, suspension wise, I'm going to replace the Pitman arm because the lower control arm and torsion bar kind of get in the way. So we're going to take the nut off and pull it. Hopefully it comes easy. Sometimes they fight. Probably should have done this before I put the header in, but hopefully we can do it. I think we just squeeze in there. Alright, I found with pullers, once you get a little bit of tension on there, once you kind of hit them, sometimes they'll come loose. Alright, well, it's pretty dang stuck on there, so I think we gotta heat her up. Alright, let's hit her with the impact. There we go. Alright, now we'll just clean up the splines. Here's our new arm. They do have a notch. Actually, a few notches, it looks like, on these. So it only goes on one way. We know we were at the limit here, so. Also want to make sure we have the right Pitman arm. Looking good.
Alright, I finally got the Pitman arm on. I ended up heating it, and then you can see it took a lot of torque. I deformed the nut a little bit, but it's up to where it was before. It's tight, so that's good enough. Now we can go ahead and get our upper and lower control arms back on. After looking over everything, I don't think the strut rod is supposed to be bent. So it has kind of a curve that looked factory-ish to me, so I thought maybe it was to clear something, but pretty sure at some point either the wheel was hit or tow truck driver hooked up to that, or who knows what, but I don't think that's supposed to be bent, so we're gonna have to get some new strut rods, unfortunately. Alright, so here's our new strut rod. I think it's from Mancini Racing. They make these, you can see it's quite a bit thicker than the original strut rods, and it's also straight, so that's an improvement. So I'm just going to lube up these poly strut rod bushings, we'll put it through, and then we should be able to get our lower control arm in. Alright, shove that in there. Alright, not torqued obviously, but we got the lower control arm pin fully seated. Now I'm going to go to the engine bay and start tightening the strut rod nut. Get the torsion bar back in. Alright, so there we go. Torsion bar is back in. Got our adjuster seated right. The frame mounting points are a little tight to get the control arm in, so we're going to give them a little bit of love and open them up. See if that does it. Nearly. This side needs a little bit more. Okay, now for the bolts. Alright, so here's one of our adjuster bolts. So
I'm gonna go ahead and hit the threads with some anti-seize, just because they're a little chewed up. This will hopefully help prevent some going. So the nuts were out before, so that's how we're gonna do it again. But I went ahead and just snugged up the upper control arm bolts. We're going to want to torque everything at right height. Not as big of a deal with poly bushings, but definitely important for the lower control arm bushing. So now we can go ahead and get our upper control arm ball joint installed. So we'll drop it in, start threading her in, and hopefully it torques up to spec. So the torque spec's 125 foot-pounds. We gotta run it down first, obviously. Alright, torque this and hopefully not pull the car off jack stands or anything like that. Oops. Alrighty, torqued up fine. If it doesn't torque up, a lot of guys will just weld them up. Obviously you just can't replace it again, but beats not having a ball joint. Go ahead and put our boot on there. So now we're going to replace the lower ball joint, which actually bolts to the spindle. So this also doubles as where the tie rod bolts onto the spindle. There we go. Alright, so there we go. That's how it sits on there. Then here's our through bolts. So the nut goes towards the rear, meaning like this. Alright, I'm just going to zip it down with the impact and we'll torque it once it's in the car. Alright, so now we can... Okay, now we should be good to get the spindle set back in place. So we'll start with the lower ball joint since it's got to go up from the bottom. Alright, I went ahead and backed off our adjuster fully, so we should be able to get this up onto the upper ball joint without having to jack it up and fight the torsion bar. So before we pull it up, we need to get our new shock in. So we'll just feed it up over here. Make sure our bushing is on too. Okay, we'll tighten that up in just a second. Now we should be good to raise this up and get it seated onto the upper ball joint. Then
gonna have to fight the shock, so. I'm just gonna grab the jack to make life easier. Get our nut on. Now we can go ahead and tighten the ball joint nuts right now. Gotta look up the torque spec. The torque spec for the upper ball joint is 55 foot-pounds. Okay, and then now we just need to get our cotter pin in there, obviously. We also need to install the Zerk fitting. Tighten that down. Gotta go just a little bit more. Alright, and then the lower ball joint nut goes to 100 foot-pounds. It goes a little bit more. Might be it. Alrighty, there we go. We also need to torque the lower ball joint to spindle mounting bolts to 125 foot-pounds. Alright, I also went ahead and tightened the lower shock mounting bolt, in addition to the upper mounting nut, which has a jam nut installed also to keep it from backing out. So everything else, we're going to torque with weight on the car. So now we're ready to go ahead and get our rotor and new caliper in place. Alright, so here's our new rotor. It is side specific because it's drilled and slotted. This is the driver's side, obviously. It did come with new races installed. A lot of times it's best practice to knock these out and use the ones that come with the bearings just because they're designed together, obviously. I can't actually get at the back side of this bearing and I don't want to deal with cutting and welding on it and blah blah blah. So we're just going to run it and it'll be fine. So to start with, we got to get our rear inner bearing installed. To do that, we got to pack it full of grease. So I usually just grab a nice dollop in my left hand and just get to packing like that. And once you see the grease coming out like that, oh, you can't even see. So I just pack like this, and once you see the grease coming out like that, that's how you know you can rotate the bearing and keep doing that. You want it to come out the rollers just like that all the way around the circumference, and then it's good to install. If you don't pack bearings, they will fail because the innards don't have grease. Might as well pack our small bearing while we got our hands all greasy. Set that aside. Now it's time for our wheel seal. Kind of a strange type with a dust boot, so it's going to be kind of a pain to drive in. So we're just going to gently tap around the metal circumference. These generally don't have a very tight interference fit, so they don't need a ton of force, generally.
Yeah. I'm mangling it. Alright, I'm just going to use a drift to work our way around and try not to damage the inner seal. There we go. Okay. Bit of a pain, but it's in. Only slightly damaged the dust shield, which is great, but it will be okay. Go ahead and pre-lube or seal. I'm going to go clean off the spindle. It's already pretty clean, but just hit it with mineral spirits and make sure there's no dirt or grime in there. Not mineral spirits, lacquer thinner or brake cleaner or whatever. Alright, we're all cleaned up. Go ahead and slide the rotor over. Go grab our outer bearing. Alright, so here's our outer bearing. Push that over the spindle. Then we've got this washer that's keyed. Then our nut. So I like to tighten these up pretty tight to start with, just to get the grease pushed out between the rollers. Otherwise your preload is going to change when you start driving it. It'll loosen up. So I like to tighten it up, spin it. That kind of pushes the grease out of the rollers. Then I loosen it up. Yep, should not have done that. Then I tighten to where it's just a little bit of drag. There shouldn't really be much in the way of tension on the nut. That feels just about right. So you can see it spins freely, add a little bit of drag, and there we go. Then we've got this cap that just keeps the nut from spinning. And finally, a fresh cotter pin. Which, where did the hole go? There it is. Okay. So we just spin this until we get it to align with the hole. We need to actually tweak the nut position a little bit. There we go. And finally we have our dust cap, which I like to put a little bit of extra grease in there because as it heats up, it'll flow in towards the bearings. We'll just gently tap that into place. Wipe our mess up. Alright, now we're ready to get our caliper on. They come uncoated, so I went ahead and put a little coat of paint on them. Here's our first one, which I gotta touch up. No, that's awesome. We know it's for this side because the line is up and the bleeder is up. The bleeder is always vertical on brake calipers. So for the brake pads, this one's going to go on the inside, just like this. Then this one's going to go on the outside. Did grease them up already. Really tight for what it's supposed to be. I don't know about that. Huh. Do not like how tight that is. Obviously it's not supposed to be like that. Alright, so our piston's definitely retracted far back enough. We're just like a millimeter off from going, so What I'm going to do for now is pull this anti-squeal backing off of one of the pads, and hopefully that gives us enough to install it. So yank that off and we'll try again. Apparently that's all it was, so weird. Okay, now we got an anti-squeal. Or sorry, not anti-squeal. We got new retainers for this, so figure out this puzzle real quick. Okay, something like that. Before we put that on, I'm going to touch up the caliper real quick with paint. Try not to make a mess. No biggie, if we get on the rotor, we'll wipe it off with brake clean. Just need to touch up where we missed, or where it fell off rather. That should be good enough. Alright, so I'm going to run Loctite on the caliper retainer bolts, just because they're little itty bitty. So this is 2-piece, so the outer piece will go on like that. Then the entire thing will go like this. Get the lower one on next. And I'll run these down with the right wrench. Alright, so obviously the rubber one that was on here before totally failed, so we just have that little bit hanging off. Mine doesn't look too rusty or anything, so hopefully it comes off easy. I do have a line wrench, which I probably should be using. But it broke free, so that's good. I don't know why it's so tight in here. Probably a little cruddy. Okay, just got to pull our little retaining clip out. You guys probably can't see anything right now, but come on. You guys are right in the way. Alright, I'm going to work on that, and I'll bring you guys back. Okay, there we go. Now for our new brake line. Okay, so there's a rounded part, so it only goes in one way. And only don't have a new clip for this, so we'll reuse the old one. Alrighty, should be tight enough. Now we just gotta get the line attached to the caliper. So we've got 2 copper washers, just the normal setup. One on either side to seal it. Alrighty, there we go. Alright, so I think that's about it for the suspension over on this side. Obviously we have to go through and tighten everything, but I do that at ride height. just to make sure all the bushings are settled in properly. If you tighten it not at ride height, but at full droop, when the suspension comes all the way up, it could tear the bushing. Not super big deal with poly, but with the lower control arm bushing being a traditional rubber bushing, we definitely want to do that there, so might as well do it for all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and do the exact same thing on the other side. Fun. And then the last thing I need to do is just get the tie rod and idler arm replaced. So we have an idler arm on the other side opposite of the Pitman arm, and then we have the tie rod ends to replace. Well, I forgot to order tie rod ends like an idiot, but it's simple enough. It's just these ball joints that screw out of the adjusting sleeves. Screw new ones in at about the same place. Do it for both sides. Put it up and on. Bam, done. And then we also have the idler arm that I'll replace, but it's simple enough too. So there's just a through bolt that goes through there, bolts it to the body, and then this bolts into the tie rod to keep it aligned properly across the whole length of the car. So I think we'll call it there. Thanks for tagging along. Lots more to come on this car. Next time we're going to be basically finishing everything up to get the car started. So we'll be going through and doing all the plumbing. We'll be doing the accessories, wiring, that kind of thing. So we're getting real close in this car. I'm looking forward to it, and I'll hopefully see you guys then.